You're listening to the Decidedly podcast with Sanger Smith and Sean Smith. Our mission is to help business owners like you defeat bad decision-making so you can improve your health, wealth, and relationships. We do this by digging deep into the stories and expertise of our guests and distilling their knowledge into actionable wisdom for you to carry into your life and business. If you're new to the show, welcome. Be sure to hit the subscribe button so you won't miss out on any of our weekly episodes. If you prefer to watch this week's episode, head on over to YouTube for the full video. Now, let's get into this week's episode and defeat bad decision-making in your life and business.
I was watching something the other day, and it was a clip from a podcast, Howie Mandel podcast. I don't know if you saw this.
Okay.
And so they had Bill Burr on, the comedian.
Yeah.
And so they're talking to Bill. And everything's going normal. And then Howie brings in Billy Corgan.
Okay.
All right. So you know who Billy Corgan is? All right.
Billy on the street.
No. Guy from Smashing Pumpkins.
Oh, then I have no idea who Billy Corgan is.
Yeah. So I didn't apparently he's a big thing in music. You've heard the Smashing Pumpkins.
Yeah. Like one song.
Yeah, one song maybe. So apparently
not that old.
Well, apparently they're a big deal. And so he brings in Billy Corgan. And he's like, Billy, tell the story. This is Bill. Well, Billy had told the story that he had learned later in life that Bill Burr was his half brother.
What?
Yeah.
Okay.
So these guys, Bill Burr, successful comedian, Billy Corgan, successful musician.
Both named Bill.
One's Bill, one's Billy, half brothers.
Wow.
All right. So the issue was that, so let me, before I go on. So this guy let me just start saying polygamy's bad. All right. I'll just start with that. All right.
Okay.
So that's off the table. That's my premise.
Okay.
I'm stating that it's bad. All right. But this guy, their dad, two separate families, they didn't know about each other. He ran two families, smartly named them both Bill so he wouldn't mess it up.
Yeah, I guess
they look identical, by the way. They look like twins.
Huh.
Like Billy Corgan looks exactly like Bill Burr. And I got to hand it to this guy. This guy raised two successful people in their career. I'm
finding it difficult 1 month in to just do one.
I was impressed.
How do you do that?
I was like, hey, this guy kind of did all right, I guess.
What do you do? You say, I'm going to be gone.
I'm going to be gone for the weekend. He was a musician, so traveling musician. So I guess every time he'd go off on a gig, he was just going to the other house on the other side of town or whatever. I don't know.
Made enough money for two families.
Apparently.
Well, misplaced priorities, I'd say. If you do it that well, you could have done it well the right way.
Well, I guess, but he doubled up. Anyway, so the point is, so Bill Burr didn't know about this.
He's finding out live on the air.
Well, he knew his dad had another family,
okay.
And he knew Billy Corgan was his stepbrother, had never met him before.
Oh, okay.
So Mandel just blindsided him. It's like, hey, here he is.
Yeah, what's that? That's very Jerry Springer of him.
Oh, yeah, he was pissed. He was like, oh, hey, I didn't, you're kind of an asshole for doing this. And that's what he said.
Uh-huh.
But I got to give him credit. He didn't storm off.
Yeah.
Like he's just like, all right, I guess we're doing this. This isn't cool, but and he finished the interview. I was like, oh, I don't know if I would have had the strength to just stay there.
You don't have any surprises for me, do you? On the
No, I was just impressed that because it got me thinking, never storm off. Like if you're in a bad situation,
it never does make you look good.
Oh, well, number one, you're storming off and invariably you're going to get out the door and you're like, I forgot my keys. And then you got to go back looking like a punk, I get my keys. Now I'm really leaving, that it's raining. You're like, I'm getting my raincoat too, and then, but then you got to come back at some point. You can't just leave permanently.
You can't never see him again.
Yeah. And you're always going to look like a punk just coming back.
Yeah. Well, it takes a high level of self-awareness and emotional control and command over your behavior to not storm off.
Right.
And speaking of behavior, we have behavioral scientist, or cognitive scientist, Dr. Art Markman on the show today. He was on episode 128. You might remember, one of our favorite guests. I always learn a lot when Dr. Markman's on the show. Dr. Markman is the senior provost for academic affairs at the University of Texas at Austin, and I'm impressed with myself for remembering that lengthy title.
Very good. You didn't have that written down.
No, I didn't. But stick around, learn about how your brain works, learn about how your behavior is impacting your brain and vice versa. I'm Sanger Smith with my dad, Sean Smith. This is Decidedly. How's it going, Art?
Going well. How are you?
Great. Hey, thanks for coming back again.
Yeah. Oh, you had such a good time last time. How could I say no?
Encore performance, back by popular demand.
Dude, I didn't know you're a Lego guy.
Oh yeah. I am. So the story is, I have a clock that on my wall with a picture of the Death Star on it that I bought as a reminder that I'd gone over to the dark side when I took my first administrative role at the university. And so after that, I started building some Star Wars Legos, and from there it mushroomed into I've got cars, and I've got a Concorde over there. It's like adult coloring books, really.
It's awesome. I did my first Lego, after the age of like 6, maybe a few months ago. And it was the Notre Dame. My dad actually gave it to me for my birthday.
Wow.
The Notre Dame was like 4,300 pieces. He gives it to me, and I was like, whenever I got it, I was like, oh man, this is a project. You gave me a project?
Give me homework.
I was like, I have homework? And then so I put it off for a little bit, and I didn't start it right away. And then I started, and immediately I was like, this is super cool. This is cooler than it was when I was a kid.
Yeah. Yeah. It's definitely gotten better. Yeah. It's all over the office. For me, it's fun because in addition to just, it gets kind of zen to do it, but putting them around the office has been nice because people come into a university administrator's office and sometimes they get a little nervous, and then they look around, there's a bunch of Lego, and they're like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
He's a regular guy. Yeah.
So is there, like, you were talking about the dark side, is there some animosity between, who doesn't like the administrators?
Who does? No, I think, university faculty, we generally get hired because we're good at what we do and we want to be left alone.
Mm-hmm.
And administrators have to herd the cats. And so, we're usually creating rules for people who pride themselves in not really caring much about rules.
That's so. Yeah, that sounds like a whipping.
Yeah, and then there's budgets and things like that. It turns out you can't do everything.
Yeah, you can't research everything.
Right, and there's regulations that control what we can and can't do, and somebody's got to keep track of that, and so I love it. It's great fun. It really helps us to build things that improve things for our students. But, it's, there's a certain sense in which I feel like I went from being one of us to being one of them.
Well, you're incredibly busy doing all that, the admin work, the books you're writing, the podcast, Two Guys on Your Head. In fact, I was listening to that this week. I listened to a lot of the most recent episodes. I got to tell you, a little disappointed.
Yeah, as you should be. We knew that doing a series on disappointment was courting disaster.
Yeah, just giving you a hard time. No, I thought it was really good, and it reminded me a lot of what's the Daniel Pink book, Power of Regret, and so are you seeing a lot of correlation between regret and disappointment? Are those two sides of the same coin, or how are those related?
Yeah, Yeah, I mean, I would say that regret is a very powerful form of disappointment, but one of the places where regret and disappointment sometimes differ is that with regret, it is often the case that it seemed like a good idea at the time. So a lot of times when you regret something, it's because through experience, either years later or just because of the ruination that gets caused by your actions, you realize that what you thought you should do isn't what you should actually do. Whereas with disappointment, you may very well have done everything right. And in fact, even in hindsight, feel like you couldn't have done any better. And yet the outcome didn't come out the way you wanted it to. And so it isn't always the case that something that's disappointing to you is disappointing because you did something wrong. It could be circumstances just didn't go your way. And so I think there's a lot of other factors that can lead to disappointment that are not quite the same as what happens in regret.
So in regret, if I can remember right, there are different types of regret. There is sort of foundation regret, which is a decision you made early on to sort of set your course, boldness, moral and relation or connectedness, I think. And are you finding that there are different types of disappointment as well?
Yeah, absolutely. But often those disappointments have to do in part with the source of the reason why things didn't go the way you wanted them to go. So, for example, I could be disappointed in a person in my life, that I had high hopes for them and they didn't do what they were supposed to do. And now I feel that disappointment. I can have disappointment, related to just circumstance. If there are times where people feel like, well, if I'd been born 10 years ago, I'd be able to afford a house. And now I can't. And that's disappointing. And so so I think a lot of the shades of disappointment are really focused on where do you judge to be the cause or the source of the reason why the outcome didn't go your way.
And is it always an unmet expectation?
It is usually an unmet expectation. I mean, it is the curse of being able to have expectations that sometimes you're going to be disappointed. The thing about being human is we can anticipate the future, which is really powerful because it allows us to motivate ourselves.
Yeah, we can make present day sacrifices.
Right, exactly.
We can make present day sacrifices that have no immediate reward or that have immediate pain. We can save money. We can work out, we can diet. But if I expect that savings to create this lifestyle or that working out to create this body image or the diet to create this weight loss and I don't get it, then I'm disappointed. Yeah, I got it.
Yeah, that's right. And so, but I mean, on the positive side, the fact that we can envision a future and have expectations about it often leads to great outcomes, right? That's the positive thing is by choosing to work out, by choosing to save, you often do open up possibilities for the future that are better than what you would have done had you not engaged in those activities. But not everything works out the way you wanted it to. And then you can be disappointed by things. And sometimes it's because you just misunderstood the world.
Yeah. You had an inappropriate expectation, in other words.
Think about people who, for example, early in their career, try a bunch of things and they just don't understand the market they're in well enough. So they actually think they're closer to being able to achieve something great than they really are. And they're disappointed at the time. And then later recognize, oh, I don't think I knew how much I didn't know.
Or they never recognize that.
It's more likely.
And they just know that they didn't get the results.
That's right.
I think a lot of times people will externalize the cause of that disappointment. So they'll say, all right, well, this didn't go my way. it wasn't my fault. It was, the refs, or bias, or, this person cheated me, or, bad luck, or whatever.
Yeah, that's an example of someone not recognizing how far away they really were.
That's right. That's right. As the old saying goes, it is a poor craftsman who blames their tools.
Sure.
How do you sort of reconcile the reactions that people may have to disappointment from, on one hand, I should recalibrate my expectations more accurately, or another reaction might be, well, I've got to sort of redouble my efforts. I've got to work harder. Is there a best way to go typically?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. One of the foundations of all the work on mindsets, and so many people have taken from Carol Dweck's wonderful work on growth versus fixed mindsets. One of the elements of that is that people with that growth mindset are much more likely to use a disappointment as a jumping off point for engaging in additional effort. Those with a fixed mindset think, well, I've just reached the limit of my ability, so I'm kind of stuck. And so I think that there is often great value in analyzing the situation and then deciding, should I put more effort into it? So you shouldn't always put more effort into stuff. Sometimes you are, in fact, going in the wrong direction. And I think it takes a tremendous amount of self-confidence to really analyze a situation at arm's length and recognize, you know what, I may have done some of the wrong things. I may not have put in the right amount of effort. I may need to learn new things before I'm going to succeed, as opposed to just blaming circumstance or blaming somebody else for the failure. But I think in general, most of us can afford to put more effort in on things than we think we can. And so redoubling that effort is often a great idea. But, it's the interesting thing about concepts like grit, for example, is we should have passionate persistence in our activities, except when we shouldn't, right? I think there has to be enough wisdom to know this is not going to yield to my efforts, and I am better off trying to achieve a goal by different means, or changing my goal in some way to do something that's more likely to succeed.
I have found, this is just me personally, that's a really difficult thing to do. I was brought up, because my dad was brought up, never quit. Don't quit. Don't be a quitter. That's the last thing you want to be, right? And so I would find myself sort of continuing on things that I probably should have stopped doing.
Really? Like what?
Probably football. It's probably
Really? You were bad at it?
I wasn't great. I mean, it
Were
was
you
better
so
than
bad that you needed to quit?
Well, it's the first thing that popped in my head. But there, I think, did you find growing up that
No,
you had a lot of
trying
pressure
to switch it off yourself?
Yeah,
I want to know what you think you should have quit.
That probably, yeah, that
High school football.
high school football. I'm gonna go with that. I'm gonna go. With
Okay,
that. All right.
I feel like we could work on our self-reflection.
Well, you caught me flat-footed. Wasn't prepared.
You brought it up.
Well, yeah, that's true. That's true. Well, did you feel like you were raised to not quit?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. No. Well, I definitely was, because that's what you told me all the time. I wasn't allowed to quit.
Glad you were listening.
Yeah, I wasn't allowed to quit things, and I still carry that with me. I don't want to quit. I don't value quitting, or I highly value not quitting. Rather, would be the more appropriate way to say it. Are there things that I probably could have quit? I don't know if I would use the word quit necessarily. Like, I think what you really tried to teach me was honor your commitment.
Yes.
So, that was the overarching lesson. But, the way that that's delivered to an 8-year-old is don't quit.
Right.
And there have been plenty of things. There are things I'm doing right now I want to quit. But
like what?
Their commitment. Well, I'm
see, how's that feel?
No. There's. Let me say it this way. And you'll understand why I'm not sharing about it. there's commitments I've made to people and organizations that I'm going to continue doing that I definitely don't want to continue doing.
Yes.
But I said I would do it. So that I think is fine. But as far as like, I don't have anything in my life that I can think of where, you know, I really tried for 25 years to learn to play the guitar and I just stink at it and I should have given it up.
Yeah. I was in an organization for, about 10 years and probably about 5 years longer than I should have been. And so I told him I was not going to, you know, continue on. And so the announcement was made that I had resigned, and that like hit me like, oh, resigned.
I'm a quitter.
I thought it just like didn't renew. You made it seem more significant than it was. So how do you properly assess then which path you should go down? You know, when you should appropriately quit something.
Yeah, I mean, I think you know, there's a variety of aspects to that. So part of it is, what is the opportunity cost? So, for example, when you think about something like high school football, by participating in high school football, there's a bunch of things you're not going to do. It's very hard to, I don't know, be in the choir or the drama club if you're also on the football team, because they soak up the same amount of time and you've got to be able to do your schoolwork. And so there's an opportunity cost for everything we're doing. And at some point you got to ask yourself, is that opportunity cost too high? Would I be better off doing something else? You got to ask yourself, why am I continuing to do this? So sometimes it is about commitment to other people, and that's very powerful and often very important, because even if the particular project you're working on is one that you don't really feel like doing, by honoring your commitment and getting a reputation as someone who honors their commitments, that might have benefits later on. So I think there can be very good reasons for continuing things. But for example, there's a lot of research on what's called the sunk cost fallacy. This idea that time and energy and money that we've already spent justifies continued expenditure of time and energy and money. And the fact is, the time and the energy and money that you've put in on a project that you did is gone. You can't get it back. If you don't think it is worthwhile to continue this project, you shouldn't continue to work on it just because you spent a lot of time or energy or money on it. You should really decide, are there better uses of those resources now than spending it on this? So it is well worth analyzing, why do I think I need to persist at this? And then making that determination by saying, look, I've got a limited amount of time in my life and a limited amount of other resources I'm going to be able to bring to bear. Is this really a good use of those resources? I'll tell you a quick story. I was the co-author of a cognitive psychology textbook for a few editions of a book that was originally authored by two colleagues of mine. And on their third edition, they brought me on, and we worked on it for a couple of editions. And when it came time for the fifth edition, I remember I met one of my colleagues who was one of my co-authors at a conference, and we were walking around a city, and he was in his like early 50s at that point, so not in direct sight of retirement. And at that moment, he said to me, you know, there's a limited number of things I'm going to be able to say in the rest of my career. I'm just not sure that another edition of this textbook should be one of them. And I thought it was such a great insight to realize that even if you're 15 or 20 years from retirement, the amount of time that you have left to work is still limited, and you should choose wisely how you spend that time.
Yeah, that's an interesting.
Yeah, that's a really good point. You know, a lot of times people get more thoughtful the more limited the resources are. You know, they get more, consider the possibilities and the return more.
Yeah.
You know, it's a classic example of like people living paycheck to paycheck. Hey, get paid on Friday. Friday night, we're having fun. Next Friday night, I don't know. I don't get paid till next week. It's like all of a sudden I'm really considerate about what I'm doing.
Being under-resourced certainly causes you to be more creative.
Yeah.
You know, with solutions.
But to that point, that's an example of somebody who's aware of his resource limitations, even though they're not immediately impacting his life. Like he's choosing to let it impact his life even though he's not being forced to have it impact his life. That's the good side of human expectation.
That's right. Friday night payday and still just going home.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I read an interesting study sort of related to that very thing. This was about people who got kidnapped in South America. And so kidnapping had gone way up in, I think it was like Brazil or Colombia or something like that. And what they found is that they would start negotiations with the kidnappers, and the kidnappers would want, $100,000. They're like, oh, this, they would start that on Sunday, whatever. They got kidnapped on Saturday over the weekend. We want $100,000. So they'd wait. How about 50? They'd wait. And as it got closer to Friday, when they wanted to go out and party and spend the money, they could get the hostage back for like a couple $1,000.
Really?
Yeah, it was.
Wow.
I'll just bring you by a 6-pack.
Well, yeah, and that happened. Yeah, so it was.
Don't get kidnapped on a Saturday. Is what
you got to sit the week out.
That's
Right.
a long week.
Yeah.
Or carry a 6-pack with you all the time. Do you find that different personality types find it easier to detach from a task or quit a task than other personality types?
Yeah, I mean, for one thing, there's one of the big 5 personality characteristics is conscientiousness. And conscientiousness is really all about, do you finish the stuff you start? Do you follow the rules? And so if you're highly conscientious, you find it awfully difficult to quit something. And people who are lower in conscientiousness find it much easier to say, you know what, I'm just not going to do this. And either one of those could be positive or negative depending on the situation. So highly conscientious people often do really well in school because they persist on these assignments and the thing about getting an assignment in school is if the teacher gave it to you, you can probably complete it. So putting in that effort and finishing the assignment is beneficial to your learning experience. But when you get out into the murky world in which not every project that you take on is in fact a problem that's solvable, learning to walk away from things then becomes really valuable. And, if you think about a creative endeavor of some kind, you have to go through a lot of false starts before you hit on something that's really great. And if you feel like I've got to persist even longer on the variety of dead ends that you go down, that isn't necessarily a benefit to you. So there's a reason why when you look at creative pursuits, whether it's the arts or even people who are very creative scientists, they often tend to be somewhat lower in conscientiousness than people who are really good at dealing with solvable problems where you just need to keep your nose to the grindstone.
So is there a greater capacity to absorb frustration in those type of personality types?
Or are they just less frustrated?
I think they can get frustrated, but it's such a powerful motivator to complete something that they come back to it. It's more anxiety provoking to walk away from something than it is to persist at it.
Yeah. That's why, my friends give me a hard time because I used to say often, even on the show, like, we won't hire someone who got straight A's because I don't want somebody who thinks I just got to do this assignment and then I'm going to get the immediate reward. And somebody who's had that experience their whole life, probably going to be pretty frustrated working for me. But there's a lot of truth to it where, if I have a job that works that way, where I'm giving them solvable problems, then I want somebody like that on my team. But
yeah,
for example, I think a lot of people in our industry get frustrated because they want to be a financial advisor. And what drew them to that was they were solving solvable problems, without the human element of it. They were not actually working with clients. They were solving case studies. And that was very exciting. And they just put their nose to the grindstone. They got it done. But that doesn't work in the real world because sometimes people don't take the advice you give them. Sometimes people withhold information from you for some reason or another. And that is a hole that you've got to still try to provide a recommendation for them, even though you don't really know how much cash they have on the sidelines or whatever. And that mindset just doesn't work.
Yeah. You know what I like about that is how you retroactively put virtue into not getting good grades. A little self-serving, I think.
Virtue into it. But I'm, it's that I'm not saying I want the people that flunked out, but it just tells me something about them.
Yeah. And, my partner in crime on my podcast, Bob Duke, often says that a high GPA is a sign of a fertile mind, but a very high GPA is a sign of misplaced priorities. And I think there's a real wisdom in that. And I think that this is also related to this general idea of, there's that book that what got you here won't get you there. And I think a lot of people get into a profession because they're good at that low level set of tasks, whatever it is, that often doesn't require dealing with the people element, whether it's dealing with particular customers and clients, or whether it's doing managerial work where you have to herd the cats within your particular organization. And so what happens is they get noticed because of their effectiveness at dealing with the solvable problems, and then find themselves having to manage people or deal with a different kind of complexity, and find themselves ill-suited to that, in part because they have a hard time walking away from the no-win situation.
Yeah, and that's got to be super frustrating for those people. I mean, yeah. I've met a lot of people who kind of become bitter adults who were the valedictorian in high school and, honor roll at their university, and they're not exactly making the type of money that they thought they'd be making, or they're not really having the professional success that they thought they were going to have. Life's not quite as easy as they believe it was promised to them to be when they did what they were supposed to do at that stage of life. You got to feel for them. It's like, dang, they thought the message was do these assignments and it's all going to work out. And it's like, it's a little bit more complicated than that.
Yep. And one of the reasons why at the university level, we really are trying to do more work around teaching people skills and teaching people how to answer questions that the person who asked the question doesn't already know the answer to, is all about trying to help our students to navigate complexity before they graduate, and to develop those kinds of problem-solving skills for dealing with ill-posed problems and dynamic problems, which is where ultimate success lies. If you do want to be the one who gets paid the big bucks, at the end of the day, that is going to require being able to deal with and adapt to rapidly changing circumstances that have a lot of unexpected things that happen. And that is not the nature of many people's school experience.
No, it was not the nature of my experience. But the people skills are what is going to take you to the top of an organization or to the top of a profession. In most cases, your brain surgeon probably doesn't need a lot of people skills, but most people, I mean, even lawyers, engineers, the engineers and the lawyers with people skills are going to rise to the top, even though the practice of their profession might be, the essence of solving solvable problems. But how are y'all doing that for students? Because that sounds incredibly valuable.
One of the things that I think a lot of people don't appreciate is the amount of wisdom about the human condition that is wrapped up in the humanities and in the social sciences and in the behavioral sciences. So it's become fashionable when we look at university education to kind of diss the liberal arts. And that's because people often make the mistake of thinking that the major you have should correlate one-to-one against the career path you take. And so you major in history, and then somebody says, oh, you're going to be a historian? And what we don't do well, and what we're learning to do well in higher education, is actually to equip our students to say, well, I'm glad you asked that. No, I'm not going to be a historian, but by studying history, I have learned how leadership evolves in contexts. I've learned more about systems thinking because I have to see how the wide swath of history is affected by particular events that all interact with each other. I've learned how to communicate effectively and how to establish a great vision for the future. And those are all skills that turn out to be really useful, even if you never read another history book again.
What percent of the people do you think who study a certain discipline end up working in that field?
Well, if we look at the scholarly disciplines at a university, it's about 4%. So about 4% of our of our undergraduates tend to go to graduate school in the area that they majored in. So we have a certain number of additional people who will go to a professional graduate program. So they majored in biology and then they went to med school, or they majored in history and went to law school. But when we look at just, say, the percentage of students who graduate with a degree in history and then go on to get a graduate degree in history, that's about 4%.
Oh, I agree with you so much, Art. Most people hear that and they go, see, that's why history degrees are stupid. You should just go to college to get 4 years of training at the job you're going to end up taking after you graduate. And that, to me, seems pointless, because if that's what college is, if that's what the university experience is, then yeah, it's totally not worth my time. I should have just gone and worked and been an intern. I could have been an unpaid intern for 4 years and come out better off. but that's not what the actual value of the university experience is. My favorite moments in school were when we had a deep discussion about something that in no other context would I have been permitted to dive that deep on. Talking about the reasons for some historical event, or an opinion on foreign policy decision making or something. Yeah, and I'm not a political analyst or a historian or anything like that, and I didn't really want to be. But it taught me something about how to think and how to make conclusions when there's not a set of multiple choice answers that I can pick from.
Yeah. And also, I mean, if you think about just, the willingness to create a podcast like this and have guests come in and have these kinds of conversations, part of what you did in that college experience was to lay the groundwork for the kind of curiosity that then makes these kinds of conversations interesting to have. And if you think that everything that you study and everything you do has to have its primary value in the very near future, you don't build the overall intellectual framework in order to future-proof your career. Because the fact is, whatever domain you're in, technology is going to change, rules are going to change, laws are going to change, the environment's going to change, and you have to be able to adapt to that and stay ahead of it. So over the course of a 40-year career, the day-to-day experience of the work you do, even if you were to do exactly the same job you started with, that day-to-day experience is going to be
totally different. Yeah, I don't get. I get complimented, it might surprise Sean, on the work that I do.
No kidding.
But what I don't get complimented for is like being the most knowledgeable person or knowing all of the tax laws or whatever. I don't get complimented for being a super nerd, but I get complimented very often for being able to explain things well. And my clients will say, oh my gosh, we had this other advisor for 20 years. We've talked to him every 6 months about this topic. I don't think I ever understood it until I heard it from you. Oh, wow. That makes me feel really good. And when I hire people, they'll train under me and go, how the heck do you explain this so well? And I tell them, I'm like, you need to start reading novels, reading poetry. Because I think the English studying that I did contributed to that. Because, if it's not a very good book if it's just a description of events, right? Yeah. If there's no metaphor in there, it doesn't feel well written. And even somebody who's not studied is going to recognize that on some, innate level. But understanding metaphor and understanding how to come up with something on the fly and compare this thing to a different thing, well, that works really well for what I do. But if I had gone and studied only things that translate, I would have learned a lot about mutual funds, stocks, and tax planning and never been able to communicate it to anybody.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. I think you were talking about engineers and attorneys and things like that, and how they might progress in their career. And I think the biggest single factor that can impact sort of an upward trajectory in a career would be the ability to persuade people, which is communication, which is what you're
a part of it.
Yeah, I mean, just that communication ability. We were talking about what types of things you can get from sort of non-correlated academic degrees. So my undergraduate degree is from the College of Architecture. And so you wouldn't think that I'd be using that very much as a financial advisor.
Oh.
One of the first classes, there was a class we took as freshmen, first semester freshman year. It was called Design 101, right? And our professor was kind of one of those hippy dippy guys. He said, all right, the first thing we're going to do, and he took us up to the fourth floor of this building. It was this big, massive atrium. And the building was kind of shaped like a U. It had this big atrium. And we went up to the fourth floor, and he says, all right, so your first thing, we had like 3 weeks to do this. He goes, build something that'll fly across the atrium.
That was it?
That was all the instruction we had. He goes, you're going to be graded on how successfully it does that, but also how it looks. The design and beauty of it. And we couldn't be powered. Like you could put a motor in it. It'd be like paper airplane kind of thing. We had 3 weeks to do it. And you'd think, well, that was a blow-off exercise. But I remember it to this day because you had to analyze, well, how am I going to do this? Because I saw one guy, he made this beautiful balsa wood sculpture that just dropped 1 foot out into the air and then went 4 stories down and just completely, exploded into 1,000 pieces. But it's interesting that the attention you pay to something, like you paid a lot of attention to the English language and poetry and how to communicate ideas very quickly. And I had to take that task and say, well, what is the task and how do I weigh beauty over function and those types of things. And so, things I still carry to this day, when approaching something.
Yeah. And those experiences are critical because they lie at that foundation of your ability to solve any difficult problem. And so whenever you're faced with some new thing, so, if you're in the financial world and a new investment vehicle comes around and you've now got to understand, how might this play a role in somebody's portfolio, or should I just walk away from this thing altogether? That's an ill-structured problem to some degree because it's not yet obvious exactly how you're going to do that analysis, but you're going to have a basis for trying to address that, for trying to turn an ill-posed problem into a better posed problem and gather the kind of information that you think you need to be able to solve it. Different disciplines will do that in different ways. In fact, we often talk about the fact that there are these notions of disciplines that people study, but we don't take the word discipline seriously. And it really should be taken seriously. When you study history is a discipline because it has a particular way of trying to explore the world, and philosophy is a discipline because it has a different way to do it. Psychology, yet a different way to do it. And internalizing at least one of those ways, if not more, makes you a really powerful problem solver because it gives you these different ways of posing questions that then turn something that you had no particular purchase on solving into something that you actually now can begin to address in a successful way.
Do you find that as you studied behavioral science, was there anything that you sort of went into the field expecting that really surprised you?
It's interesting because on the one hand, I've been surprised, I think, throughout my career in a lot of ways. But one of the things that surprised me was when I started as in the area of cognitive science, a lot of the focus was really just on information. So, for example, if you studied decision making, you would look at what are the various ways that people might make use of particular aspects of the information about options in order to make a decision. And if you wanted to think about a concept like motivation, you had to that was the domain of social psychologists. So, as a cognitive psychologist, I didn't think I was supposed to study motivation, because it was a different area of the field. And I remember at one point I did some studies on the kind of information people use in making decisions, and we had found that that people tend to focus on information that is common across a set of options, meaning that you have some value for each. So suppose you're evaluating an investment, and they've each got some projected rate of return. So you're looking at that. But then there's another investment vehicle that's also got another dimension to it that none of the rest of them have at all. You tend to just throw that piece of information off to the side because your comparison process focuses on those areas where everything matches up. And so I had done some studies early in my career demonstrating that if you gave people options that were described in part by these aspects that were comparable, and in part by these aspects that were things that were true of one and had no particular value for the other, then you tended to focus on those comparable elements. And I did that in part by having people read about the options, decide among them, and then justify that decision. And they would talk primarily about the places in which there was this alignment between the options. And I once had a reviewer say, but you didn't really focus on what people chose, like which one they chose, just what information they used. And at the time I thought, well, of course not. If I looked at which thing they chose, I'd have to know what they want. And to know what they want isn't the kind of question a cognitive psychologist answers, because that requires studying motivation. And then I remember having this moment where I took a step back and I went, well, that's just stupid. Like, why should my ability to answer a question be constrained by what type of psychologist I've labeled myself? That's just that if these fields haven't done a good job of cutting nature at its joints, then just change what's acceptable to study. And from that time on, I started engaging more with thinking about human motivation and bringing that more into my work. And, now all these years later, it's much more accepted and fashionable for people who are in the field of cognitive psychology to know about and pay attention to and use concepts from motivation to understand their work. So it was just one of these things where I think what surprised me was that I didn't understand how the boundaries of the discipline I was given affected how I conceptualized what I was and wasn't allowed to do from there onward.
How often do you think people are even aware of what their own motivation is during a decision-making process?
Rarely. The thing about motivation is our motivational brain structures are buried way deep in the brain. And all of the nifty storytelling apparatus we have is built literally on top of that and not particularly well connected to it. And as a result, we don't have a lot of great insight into exactly what it is that's motivating us at any given time. And that is one of the reasons therapy is a thing. You can't just introspect and see it yourself. You often need somebody else who's a trained professional to help you. And you probably see this all the time in financial decisions where people just have a bias for, I want to do this. And you're like, why? And they'll tell you a story.
And it makes no sense.
Yeah, it makes no sense. It couldn't possibly have anything to do with what's actually going on under the hood.
Yeah. And one of the ways that Sean and I try to combat that is to get people to identify what their deeply held values are, in order to force them to create a hierarchy of values and ask for their permission in holding them accountable to that hierarchy of values. And at least sometimes that will solve the problem, not all the time, and maybe not even like most of the time, but it will solve the problem in the sense of, if I can see you make a decision that's violating what you told me your hierarchy of values is, at least now I have I have a reason to wave a flag in front of your face and try to get you to stop this. Versus in the past, if I don't know and you've never identified it, you didn't identify it for yourself, you didn't share it with me, and I just go, something seems weird, I can't very confidently speak up in that scenario. But still, some people have motivations beyond their hierarchy of values.
Yeah. Well, and the thing is, what you can really make use of there is, even if you can't get people to stay consistent with the set of values that they express to you, in those situations in which they are now motivated to try to contradict those values, it leads to an additional discussion to say, what else is going on that you haven't been able to articulate yet and may not even be aware of, that is driving you to go against what you told me you wanted? And because look, I think we tell ourselves stories about who we are and what we want all the time, and they're stories. And the older the story is, the more likely it is to be a work of at least partial fiction. So we want to then pick at that a little bit and start saying, okay, look, I'm not forcing you to stay consistent with that, but let's at least use this inconsistency as the basis for a discussion to try to better understand where it is you really want to be.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's important. You keep asking that question about, well, what is it about this that's important to you, and sort of digging deep. So if somebody says, I want to have, $5 million at retirement. Well, why? What's important about having this number to you? And if you dig deep enough, it's a feeling of security, or perhaps. And it might be that the $5 million number isn't the number that's going to get them there. It might be more or less. I mean, who knows? And you've got to run the numbers to figure out, like, what is the deeper meaning behind what they say they want. They thought they knew what they wanted, but they did.
But people will still violate that in the future. People will still. So people might be very. In my experience, most people will, with enough pressure, go through the thought exercise when pressed of, oh, why did I say this $5 million was the number? And eventually they'll arrive at something that's like, it's worth making note of. It's because my dad died without a penny to his name, and I remember being poor as a kid, and it scares me. And for some reason, 5 million seems like enough to not have that fear. And so that's going to be my most important thing, is have stability in my life financially. And it's like, okay, cool, I can work with that. You're telling me stability is the most important, value that we can pursue with your money. So if you come off and you try to do something crazy, like buy a speedboat, and I'm telling you that that's going to threaten your retirement plan, you're going to understand I need to choose stability over speedboat. And then a few years later, some of these people, not everybody, but some people will still go, yeah, I do want that speedboat. And I go, maybe not a good idea. Yeah, no, I know you're going to be upset. I knew you were going to say that. I knew you were going to do this even before I called, but look, man, I'm going to get the speedboat. And I can't figure out why. And in those cases, so often I think it's a motivation that people are not even aware of themselves. It's a motivation of something that they recognize, at least in part, isn't really a virtue. And so they're maybe embarrassed to admit it to themselves or to me. And maybe it's status. They're motivated by status. They have been influenced by what they've seen their friends and the people in their community do. Well, that's okay. I'm not placing a judgment on that. But most people are not. They don't really want to say that.
They don't say that out loud.
So they don't say it out loud to themselves or to me. And so neither one of us know really why you're doing this.
Yeah. The funny thing, though, is sometimes what happens is people experience some kind of personal loss of some kind, and it shakes them out of stasis. So they've structured their life in a particular way. Like, I'm not going to spend any money because I want to have the money in retirement. And then a friend of theirs retires and drops dead the next day. And they're suddenly like, wait a second, I haven't gone on the vacations I wanted to go on. There are things that I wanted to do and I've never done them. And maybe pushing all of those off to retirement and having the money to do it only then is the wrong idea. Maybe actually I should try to spread out my joy a little bit. And so I think that I agree with you. I think there are times where people are just unwilling to admit a kind of embarrassing goal that they've set for themselves, perhaps, because they are, they want the bigger car or the gold watch or whatever it is. But I do think that
there's all type of nonsense with cars. Well, we really need the new one because the old ones are
600
just, they're not
horsepower,
safe.
man. Yeah.
I go through that discussion about every 2 years.
Yeah, my mom's, she definitely needs a new car.
Needs a new car about every 24, 25 months. Yeah, you're just done. So I've heard all those.
That's such a good point, though. People they'll obscure it, and sometimes it's for all of these other odd reasons. In a way, I kind of just, from a professional perspective, got to go, well, I don't know what I can do. If they for because of all of the circumstances or found themselves in this position where they have a motivation that's even hidden to themselves.
Yeah.
Just gotta.
Well, one of the things that you can do though is sometimes at least get people to slow that decision process down a little bit.
Yeah.
So I want to buy the boat. Okay. Yeah, I get it. I'll tell you what. Give for the next month, I want you to go to the boat basin as many days as you can over the next.
Yeah. Get them to realize they don't like driving out there.
I did that.
That's such a good one.
Couple of years ago, I had some clients that wanted to buy an RV. And I said, oh, you had an RV before? They're like, no. You know anybody that has one? No, but we want to buy an RV. We're going to buy an RV, and an RV is like a $200,000 purchase.
Big deal, yeah.
I said, well, here's what you do this summer. You're going to rent one, right?
Yeah.
And
see how you like.
See how you like it. If you love it, okay, but unless you love it, don't do it.
Yeah.
And
right.
They didn't do it.
Yeah. And so by slowing that down and having people ask themselves, how is this going to fit into my life? You suddenly go from the dream to the reality. I mean, cars, right? I love my car. I've probably overspent on my cars. My commute is jokingly short. I tell people if a third song comes on the radio, it's been a long commute. And so my car right now is over 3 years old. It has 13,000 miles on it. And that's driving it every day back and forth to work and everything else. I just don't have anywhere to go. I by rights ought to be driving like a $4,000 automobile, right? I mean, it's, there's no earthly reason for having a nice car given the amount of mileage I put on this thing. And yet, when I bought it, I was like, yeah, I'll spring for the next trim line.
Yeah. And some of that's okay. Some of it, and we don't have to know every single motivation, but if it's like compromising a deeply held belief, then it's definitely something that should pause. You said something earlier, like a lot of times tragedy will kind of shake people out of a belief. Yeah. I've heard that is kind of the first thing to change during a severe tragedy is actually our beliefs. A lot of people think that, if my world were get thrown upside down, like at least I have my beliefs.
Meaning that people get a different perspective during difficult times.
Well, that sounds obvious when you put it that way, but I don't only mean perspective. I mean like belief on like a deeply held belief. I mean, oftentimes people have conversion or reversion or a rejection of religion that happens right after
some of their core beliefs.
Yeah, core beliefs.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and even core beliefs around, like people who were devoted to their career, who really thought to themselves, what gives me meaning in life is the excellence that I have displayed in my work. And then they suffer a tragedy and they're like, yeah, that's all worthless. And then they go off and form a nonprofit and
I've seen that with clients, and if they'll have a like a medical episode, like a heart attack or something, and they'll come back and they're like, you know what, I'm going to retire early. I thought I was going to retire late, but I'm going to spend more time with family and whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, and so I think sometimes it's interesting. Right at the end of COVID, we had this thing that was called the Great Resignation, where all these people change jobs. And in many ways, I actually think it's a version of the same thing. Usually people suffer these personal tragedies more or less at random. You know, you have a health event that's going to be timed differently from everybody else's, or a death in the family that's timed differently from everybody else's. And so it just sort of pops up sporadically across the population. And then COVID hit, and all of us at the same time had a kind of mass tragedy in which we knew people who had died. We were all stuck at home. People lost, and suddenly everyone looked up and went, wait a second. And about a third of people went, wait a second, I hate my job. And then they quit and went on to something else. And something that normally happens in a more randomly distributed way happened at exactly the same time. And then it became a trend. So we had to call it a thing.
Well, Art, what is your biggest decision-making tip for business owners?
I think the most important thing to do is to really recognize when you should slow down and really understand the reason for the decision you're making. So when it involves finances, when it involves anything that ought to be on a spreadsheet, human intuition is really bad at that. And I think that where we're good is, when you go to a party and you meet somebody, within the first 5 seconds of talking to them, whether it's going to be a fun conversation. There are some people, they start talking to you and you're like, I don't know how quickly I can get away from this person, but hopefully it's very quickly. And so, there are some things where our gut intuition is really good, but when it's not, be willing to bring in the experts who will bring in the spreadsheets and bring in the analyses, and then listen to them, and don't think your gut's going to make up for that.
Thank you.
Dr. Art Markman, thanks for being here, man. I learned a lot again. Where can people connect with you and the work that you're doing?
Yeah, pleasure as always. Yeah, I would say find me on LinkedIn. It's the best place to find me. I write a weekly for Fast Company. I write pretty regularly for Psychology Today, and try and get the word out about ways that you can use psychology in your life. And that is by far the easiest way to find what I'm doing lately.
And I can recommend the podcast, Two Guys on Your Head, which it's a fun listen. Yeah, fun to listen to. Yeah. Thanks a lot, Art.
All right. Be well.
And I'd love talking to Art. My takeaway from that is when we were talking about disappointment and how that's related to regret, and how so often it's easy to suffer a disappointment and sort of reflexively blame something beyond our control. It was bad luck or somebody else did something, rather than reflecting on your participation in what led to that disappointment. Was it a miscalibration of expectations? Was it a lack of appropriate effort that caused me not to meet the goal and have disappointment? And really spending the time anytime I've got that disappointment that arises to say, what was my participation in that? And how can I improve next time in terms of the proper goal setting, the proper expectations, or the amount of effort that I want to put in, or bringing in other people to help. So that was mine.
I like the conversation we had around unknown motivations. It made me think of how often I might have a motivation that I'm not aware of, when I'm making decisions. And if I can identify it in other people, then I'm probably doing it too. And so if there's a mechanism that I can discover to kind of slow myself down, I at least might be able to be more aware of why I'm making certain decisions.
You just made a great decision to listen to this episode of Decidedly. Make another great decision by subscribing to the show and leaving us a review wherever you're listening. We appreciate the support. It helps business owners like you find our community and defeat bad decision-making in their own lives. For more decision-making insights, check us out at decidedlypodcast.com, on Instagram at decidedlypodcast, or grab a copy of Sanger and Sean's books from the links in the show notes. Finally, we'd like to thank Shelby Peterson of Transcend Media for editing and post-production of the show. Thanks for listening. I'm Morgan, your producer, and this is Decidedly.